Hey everyone, it's EJ from iDesign.com, and today I'm going to be going over a few tips that will help you if you ever need to animate a cord along a spline or have any type of object follow your spline and kind of be connected to the tip of your spline. So here I have an animation where I'm going to need this cord and this phone jack to go and feed into this phone. So the first thing I'm going to do is I need to animate my actual spline, and I have the cord made with a sweep object. So I'm going to go into my sweep object here, and I'm going to animate this end growth because that's going to control how my cord is going to animate on. So let's go to frame 0, and I'm going to bring the end growth all the way down to 0, and I will set a keyframe on the end growth. And then I'm going to go all the way to the end to frame 60, and this is where the end growth will go to 100%. So that cord goes all the way into the side of this phone. So with this animated, I now have my cord flying through the camera and feeding right into the phone. So the next thing I need to do is get this phone jack to go along this spline and match up with the tip of this cord. So you've seen this done easy enough that you would just go into your phone jack, go to your Cinema 4D tags, go to the align to spline, and for that spline path we're going to use this phone cord spline that we actually have this cord sweeping along, and you'll see that our phone jack went away, but if I go and adjust the position, there's our little phone jack right there. You'll see that the head of the phone jack is not going tangentially on our spline, so we just click on this tangential, and if I animate this position, scrub through here, you'll see that the phone jack actually rotates along and follows that spline the way it should. So normally you would go, okay, well, let's go to frame 0, bring this position to 0%, hit a keyframe, go to frame 60, and animate this all the way to 100, and that should do it, right? But you'll see as I scrub through the timeline that our position of this phone jack is not matching up with the position of the tip of this cord. So what you would normally do, and what I did in the past, is you'd go through here and you'd kind of just fudge it and try to just, okay, well, I'm going to set a keyframe there, and then go along and see where it goes, gets a little mismatched again, and then adjust the position again. And, you know, it'd just be a huge pain in the butt. And I'm going to show you one very simple, easy way to get around having to keyframe all of these little bits in the middle of your animation here, because it's very time consuming and we don't want to mess around with that. So I'm just going to delete those keyframes, and let's do this. Actually deleted my entire phone jack. Let me just delete the track, and let me redo this from 0, and then we'll do it to 100. Reset those main keyframes, and let's bring up the timeline so we actually can see what's going on here. So we have the align to spline position track and our end growth track right here. So they all look, the interpolation looks about the same. Now let me move this out of the way. So you'll see again we have some mismatch going on here. The tip of our cord's not matching. So simple, easy way to get this to work without having to keyframe all these middle intermediary little points here is to just go to your spline, and intermediate points by default is set to adaptive. Now watch what happens when I change it from adaptive to uniform. And if I scrub back and forth, you'll see that since I changed the intermediary points to uniform, it's now matching. This phone jack is now smack dab right on the tip end of that cord, and you can see as I scrub all the way through that it's matching up the entire length of our sweeped animation here. So it matches up with that tip of that cord perfectly. So one thing you'll notice is that with uniform, you can see that our spline interpolation is a little bit chunky. And just like the name says, uniform, the way that the intermediary points are aligned is uniformly, evenly spaced along our spline. So you can see these little chunks, and you can see it even better if I really bring down the number of points. So you can see that every little bit here has a little point or reference point where our spline goes across. So you'll see that these are evenly spaced throughout the entire spline, and that is the key to getting this to work, because before with adaptive, the way that our spline is divided is just all over the place. It's not evenly spaced. It's based on the actual form of your spline. And with uniform, it doesn't matter how your points are actually spaced on your spline, it evenly spaces the interpolation evenly throughout the length of your spline. So that's why we can get this to match up by going with these uniform intermediate points option. So now we don't want our spline to be all chunky like that, so we're going to bring that number, and usually if you go about 75, that smooths everything out. So that's looking good. So you can see by just having our intermediate points changed from adaptive by the default adaptive and changing it to uniform, it now matches up perfectly, and we can adjust any of these keyframes here and be able to have it match up. So if we want to change both of these and change it to linear, that'll still match up. Now to go even one step further with this is, you'll notice if I change the position of this, if I want to change this back to, let's say I want to ease in these keyframes here, I'll have to do it to both of these tracks, and that's a little bit of a pain to kind of adjust everything. Let me just go back to, let's do soft. So say I want to really ease in the end here and really fine tune my my track here. You'll see that it's going to be hard for me to match up exactly the second track as well, because you need to match both these tracks up. So the easiest way to go about editing all of this whole entire rig is to just get rid of, let's just delete this track. Let's go delete track and get this timeline out of the way. And we're just going to use some very simple Expresso. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to my chord, go to Expresso, bring up the window here, and we're just going to make it so whatever value is in this end growth is also is outputted to this position. So we need this 66.304% to feed into that, and however we animate this end growth is also going to be the matching percent on our position on our align to spline tag. So to do this, we're just going to drag in our align to spline tag, and we're going to need to drive the position here, so this position value, and we're going to need this sweep end growth to feed into that position. So we'll just drag our chord sweep here, and we need to pull the end growth data from this sweep. So we'll go to object properties and we'll go to end growth, and then we'll just feed that port into the position. Now you'll see that it's a little bit laggy, and the reason why is because of Expresso Priorities. So we have our align to spline happening first, And you can see that the priority is expression. Let's do generator. Now, okay, there we go. So it's all about priorities and what happens first. And that's what's causing that little bit of lag. So we need generators to happen first, which is actually the sweep, and then we have the Expresso happening, and that fixes the little lag. So if I go back to expression, you can see that little bit of lag, and we change that priority from expression to generator, and it should match up. And this, you can also fix this by just dragging this phone jack with the align to spline tag down in the hierarchy, because how Cinema 4D works is that it executes everything from top to bottom. And if your priorities are out of whack, you can see that little bit of lag, and you can see that with a lot of expression stuff with Expresso, or even dynamics and mixing it with other type of dynamics. So just keep that in mind. So you can see that just by bringing down this align to spline tag underneath of the Expresso tag, that fixes our little lag problem as well. So just got a little bit geeky there, but just keep in mind that if you're experiencing lag like that with Expresso, chances are that it's a priorities issue. So that fixes that. So now, since we have our Expresso all set up and our lag is fixed by the priorities issue, we can now go back into our timeline here, and we can then adjust our keyframe interpolation here, and adjust the keys to the way we want them to come in. And you'll see that because we have that Expresso linked up, that I can set a new keyframe in here, and everything matches up correctly. And I can even, with that uniform intermediate point option all set up, I can actually go in and adjust these Bezier points on my spline, or even add points, and the position of the not only the sweep but then the headphone jack stays the same. Now see what happens when I go back to let's see, adaptive, and I add a point. You'll see that the phone jack changes position. And you'll see, and if you're ever working on a project and you had to, say, add points or get rid of points, it changes the position of, or the actual timing of your sweep spline. So I've been in many cases where I set up a camera animation, set up a camera move that actually follows whatever I have sweeping along a spline, and then I go, oh, well, I need to change the spline a little bit, so I take a couple keyframe or a couple spline points out, and then you can see that the position of the sweep is off. So that camera animation that you had set, you would have to then reanimate that camera. But if I go and just undo all of this, if I go back to the uniform and I start deleting points, you can see that it stays relatively on the same part of that spline. So if I add a point here, it's still, the position is still the same. And adding a point here or deleting a point down the line really doesn't change the position all that much. See that? See, our position didn't really make a drastic change there. And just to really drive home the point, so if I delete this point all the way back here, you can see how far compared to the uniform that the chord jumped. So that is using a uniform intermediate point subdivision to get your chord or your spline shape, anything sweeped, and having an object stick to the front of that sweeped object, so that chord or whatever you're doing. Now to take this even a step further, I'm going to show you how to use this with not only the sweep object here, but I'm also going to show you how to do it with a spline wrap. So let's jump into a new project. Alright, so we're in a new project and I have a spline wrap with this little streak object. Let me just break down the project for you first. You can see I have this little streak, like those little light streaks that were really popular however many years ago with particular, but just recreating them and texturing them all nice in Cinema 4D. And basically this is made by a few different splines. So if I actually let me turn off the sweep, you'll see the actual splines here. So here's a spline, just a little abstract squiggly spline, and then a couple circles, and then I have all of those splines connected with a connect object, and then I have just swept that entire spline profiles along a straight spline. So this spline right here, you can see it right there, and so that forms our streak. And then what I do is I just spline wrap that sweep along this spline right here, and you can see if I turn off this, you can see the spline right back here. So that's the main wrap spline right there that I'm wrapping that streak along. So let's go back into our main view here. Alright, something like this. Okay, so already I have animated the offset here. Let me make this a little bit less compact here. There we go. So you'll see I have animated the spline wrap that kind of sweeps in, slows down in the middle, and then zoops right out. Is zoop a word? It's a word now. But here we go. We have our spline wrap go in, slow down a little bit, and then zoop right off the screen. Alright, so what do we want to do here? What I want to do is the same exact concept that we did with the cord with the phone jack, except that I want to see I have this little light here. I want this light to be positioned right on the tip of the start of this streak. And what I'm going to do is, once I render this out, I'm going to export that light and use it for you can use it for like particular, to drive particular to emit particles on the tip of this streak, or you can use a light to drive the 3D position of like a lens flare. So both of those things would be perfect to have on the end of, or on the tip of this streak, that you can then composite a lens flare or particles in After Effects. So you can do this with a lot of things by using lights and just tracking them to objects' movement in Cinema, and then bring it in as a AEC file, bring in that camera data, and then composite cool stuff onto it using the 3D position of that light. So again, I'm going to use an align to spline tag, and I'm going to make sure that the tag is using this main wrap spline, which it is. So I can go in here, let's delete that track, and you can see that as I animate this position, my light is going along that spline. Let's actually see if we can make that light bigger? Let's see. Let's just let's just add a fall off so we can actually see what this is looking like. And we don't want this to actually cast any light, so we can just turn no illuminate. Just leave that on, just so we can see the light a little bit better here. Okay, so first things first is we need to change this intermediate points from adaptive to uniform like I did before. And see, with the point number is up to 75 just to smooth out that spline interpolation. You can see as we go down in numbers, it really makes our spline interpolation very chunky. So we'll go back to 75. And we will go, and since I have a very custom spline keyframe interpolation here, I can't just match those keyframes, because if I want to edit it, it's going to be a big pain because I have to match up the two time tracks. So what I'm going to do is, like in the chord in the beginning of this video, I'm going to use Expresso, but it's going to get a little bit more complicated this go around, and I'll show you why. So you see that we ran into the priorities issue in the last chord, but we won't here because our because our priorities are right. So we'll have we'll add our Expresso here, which will happen first, and then our generator down here. So let's go and add a Cinema 4D tag Expresso, and we're gonna get pretty geeky here, so just bear with me. So what we want to do is the same thing we did before, and that is, let me get to a good point here. So we want our light to be stuck to the tip of this streak. So we're going to go and drag in this align to spline tag and move it over here, and we're going to need to adjust. We're going to need to feed information into that position. So we need to get the movement of this spline wrap offset and feed it into to drive the position of the align to spline. So we'll choose the position value here, and then we'll drag in our spline wrap over here, and we need the keyframed offset. You can see how we have the offset keyframed, and we need to somehow object properties offset. We need to have this offset value somehow drive that position. But one thing to notice is that once this is set up, you'll see that it doesn't match up at all. And the reason for this is because you'll see as I go to the beginning of this animation, like in the chord animation, we were dealing with a value of 0% to 100%, and that matched up perfectly with the align to spline position because the value can only go from 0 to 100. But with this spline wrap, we're going to negative 100% and then going to, let me get the Expresso back in there, we're going to positive 100. So that's why our light is off. So you can see that our offset only really goes to 0% right about frame 25, 26, and then it starts going, our align to spline starts at 0 and then starts going from 0 to 100. So that's why it's off. So we need to somehow remap those values that make sense and convert those negative 100% to positive 100% and make it more map better to match the just 0 to 100% that you're limited to in your align to spline tag. Are you guys following me? All right, let's get into some somewhat nitty-gritty Expresso. But this will come in handy if you ever have to do something where you need to stick something onto your spline using SplineWrap instead of just a sweep. All right, so we need to remap the values and feed in new values that match up with the 0 to 100. So to do this, we're going to create a new Expresso node, and we're going to use a I always have trouble finding these. Okay, calculate range mapper. All right, so what a range mapper is going to do is remap values from one object and spit out different values that you define to another object here. So we're going to get rid of that port, and we're going to feed in the offset values into the range mapper, and then we're going to output a different value that we can choose here. So we have all these options here. And the first thing we're going to do is for the input range, since we're dealing with percentages in both position of our align to spline tag and with our offset, let's go back into our range mapper. We're going to change the input and output ranges to just %, just to keep all of that straight. So you can see down in our parameters, we are now dealing with percentages. So far so good. So our input lower and input upper are going to be the main things that we're going to be dealing with. So our input lower, remember that it goes from negative 100% to 100%. So our input lower is actually going to be a negative 100. But we're still outputting the 0 to 100 value to that align the spline tag, because remember, this position value can only go from 0 to 100%. So we're all good right here. Alright, so let me get this and connect the output node to, or output port to the position port, and you'll see our light just jumped. And you'll see that if I scrub along here, the light is moving along with the spline, but you'll notice that it's kind of in the middle of our streak. And the reason why that is because on our spline wrap, our spline object, it's not measuring to the tip of our spline, it's measuring to the middle. So what we need to do is fix it so instead of the middle of our spline, it's connected to the tip of our object here. And we can do this very simply, and that's by adding a new node, and we're going to add a Expresso math. So to understand this better, think of the rear end of the streak as being 0. Where the light is currently, think of it as being 0.5. And the tip, or the front end of our streak, think of that as being 1. So since our light is at 0.5, that's why we're using this math node to multiply or double that, so the light goes from 0.5 to 1. So we just simply multiply it using this math node. So let's disconnect that output, and I'm going to bring this range mapper port and connect it to the input. And then what I'm going to do is, remember, I have to multiply it by 2 to get it to the front here. So for our function, we're going to use multiply, and for input, we're going to multiply by 2. All right. So now we're going to output that value that's multiplied and feed that into the position. And you'll see that as I did that and multiplied it by 2, we now have our light fixed on the tip of our streak. And you can see this a little bit better if I go ahead and create a result node and see what values this is spitting out. So it says 0.79, but this is basically like 79%. So if I go into here, see it's basically like 79%. If I just take what was, let me create a new result node, and you can see what that value is before we do that multiply, and you can see why it was off was that it was just outputting that like basically 0.4 or 40%. And if I let's get rid of that math node, and you'll see that that's why our position was in the middle, is because we're outputting 0.395, And 0.395 on position is that dead center of our streak here, when really, you know, we needed to double that to go to the front of that streak. So let's disconnect that, reconnect that, and there we go. So we now have that matching up correctly. So we have our spline wrap offset being remapped, so we take into account the negative 100% that our spline wrap offset goes to, and have that remapped and multiplied by 2, so we have it from, instead of the dead center of our streak, to the tip of our streak. And we do that by multiplying by 2 with our math node, and then we output that value to our align to spline, and that maps it to the tip of our streak. And now we can render this bad boy out and export out the 3D information with our light and composite a flare, a lens flare on the tip of our streak. And this is all done because we used the uniform intermediary points of our on our spline instead of the normal adaptive. You can see, as I bring this back to adaptive, you can see that everything matches up wrong. But with uniform and having all of our spline interpolation spaced evenly along our spline, we're all aligned up and looking good.